Good morning,
Morning,
good
Rabbi.
morning, good morning.
Morning.
Almost there. Okay, so now let's get the Zoom. Okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. Our learning today is sponsored by Ashley Berman, Le'iloi Nishmas's grandmother, Leah Bas Yitzchak. May her neshama have an aliyah.
Amen.
Um, so we were learning yesterday that about the parameters of mitzvah l'kayim divrei hames, that there's a mitzvah to fulfill the wishes of the decedent. And the last thing that we saw was in the Imrei Yaakov and Sifkat and Lamed Daled that I'm pointing to right over here. When we say that there's a mitzvah to fulfill the wishes of the decedent, there's a machlokes in the Rishonim between Tosfos and the Ritva as far as how when there is such a mitzvah. According to Tosfos, it only applies when the decedent before his death has given the asset that he wishes to be used for a specific purpose. He's put it in a segregated account or has given it to someone to do something with those assets. Then the heirs are obligated to fulfill the wishes of the decedent. If, however, according to Tosfos, there has been no segregation of those monies or of those assets to be used for a specific purpose, and it's just part of the general estate, so then the mitzvah of l'kayim divrei hames no longer applies. And the Ritva argues, and he says that even if there has been no segregation of the asset that the decedent wishes to be given to someone, as long as he has made it clear to his heirs that this is his wish, then they have an obligation to fulfill that wish. Now, this is all above and beyond the mitzvah of kibud av va'em, the mitzvah of honoring one's parents. This is a separate mitzvah. So even if the heir is not a child, let's say that the decedent didn't have children, and the heirs are cousins or nieces or nephews, and there's no mitzvah of kibud av va'em, there is still nonetheless the mitzvah of mitzvah l'kayim divrei hames. Now, when you add the mitzvah of kibud av va'em to the mix, then even if you could argue, well, he didn't, I'm going to go like Tosfos, and he didn't set aside the money in a special account, there still may be a mitzvah of kibud av va'em, and we're going to get to that in just a second. Okay, so that's where we're up to. And now let's go to the to Sifkat and Lamed Imrei Yaakov. We had said in this halacha that when it comes to gifts or pledges, I should say, of charity, the person makes a pledge to tzedakah. Is there an obligation for the heirs to honor that pledge? So the Rav Shulchan Aruch had said, it depends. If he gave explicit instructions to his heirs that I've made this pledge to tzedakah, I want you to honor it, so then they are obligated to honor that pledge. But if he only made a pledge to the tzedakah and did not, and even if the tzedakah can prove that the pledge was made, but there was no instruction made to the heirs to fulfill such a pledge, so they can argue al pi halacha that they have no obligation to fulfill that pledge. Because what is a pledge? A pledge is like a shavua. It's like an oath that a person takes. Once a person dies, that oath becomes null and void. An oath to that from A to B, that A is going to do something for B, is only as good as A's lifetime. Once A's life has expired, so then that pledge or that shavua now is no longer active. And the heirs no longer have an obligation to honor that pledge, because they can say, our father never gave us those instructions. He may have made that pledge to you. That pledge no longer applies. So that's a huge, it's a huge chiddush, right? But it's important to know. So let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Afal pishu hu nadar o nishba, even if the father or the decedent made a pledge or an oath that he was going to give this money to a particular tzedakah, and he says, Ken kasav harama simin reish nun beis. This is explicitly from the Shulchan Aruch, from the Ramah. Bahata'am mishum deshvua oneder afilu la'aniyim eno osa kinyan. He says, and the reason for this is, we all know this halacha that's brought down in Hilchos tzedakah, that if a person makes a pledge, then they are obligated al pi halacha to fulfill the pledge. There's no question about that. And delo amrinan amirasa legavoa kimesirasa lehedjot ela b'kedushas haguf o b'kedushas bedek habayis. Aval benoder la'aniyim eno kimesira ela shemechuyev l'kayim nidra. He says there is such a concept in the Gemara that amirasa legavoa kimesirasa lehedjot, which is quoted by the poskim, and they say that when you make a pledge to tzedakah, it's like making a pledge to hektish. And the Gemara says that hektish being, temple property, I plan to give something to the temple. We know that when it comes to temple property, all you need to do is make a declaration of your assets and immediately belongs to the temple. There's no transaction, there's no kinyan that needs to take place in that instance. But, says the Ramah, that doesn't apply to tzedakah pledges. It is only akin to making a hektish pledge, but it is not exactly analogous to making a hektish pledge. When you make a hektish pledge, you say, my silver chalice is hereby hektish. Okay, so what that means now is that it is no longer my silver chalice as soon as I've made that declaration. But if I say I hereby pledge to give my silver chalice to tzedakah X, so that they can sell it and raise funds for their charity, so then that chalice does not belong to tzedakah X. It's just that I have a halachic obligation to now give the silver chalice to tzedakah. So it's not exactly the same as hektish. And since it's still legally mine, it's in my possession, if something were to happen to me and I were to die before I deliver the chalice to the tzedakah, so then the kevin shemes, ein hayorshim tzrichim l'kayim neder avihim. And so once the father has passed away, a child is not obligated to fulfill a pledge of a father. They are obligated to fulfill the financial debts of the father, but if it's only in the form of a pledge, they are not obligated. So there's a difference between when there's a creditor. If there's a creditor coming after the father because the father owed money before he passed away, then the children have to use the money from the estate to pay off that debt, because the estate is encumbered, it's mishubad to the debt. But that's not the case when it comes to a tzedakah pledge. And he writes just to V'shailos Utshuvas Rabbi Akiva Eger Siman Kuf Mem Vav Mefakfek Al Za'ayin Sham. Rabbi Akiva has a long discourse on this subject, which we're not going to look into. It's quite complicated. But he says that he goes back and forth on this halacha quite extensively. Okay, let's go on to the next Imrei Yaakov. And then maybe I'll tell you a story. Ad sheyitzavim bifneihem. And some say that there's no law of mitzvah l'kayim divrei hameis unless ad sheyitzavim bifneihem, unless instructions are made expressly to the heirs that the father would like them to do something, and then like the Shulchan Aruch writes, the yishtaku v'yakablu es devarav, and they have to if they are silent, right, and they accept his instructions without protest, so then halachically they're obligated to fulfill the wishes of the decedent, which seems to imply that that if they protest and say, I don't want to do this, they have the rights of refusal. But once the father gives them an instruction that after I die, I want you to do this, such and such with my estate, uh, even if they're silent, without expressly accepting that they're going to do this, they are halachically obligated to do so. So if the father would tell them, I want you to give this money to Ploni for a gift, or I want you to give such and such for tzedakah, so then they're obligated to do so. And so the Imrei Yaakov says, V'hu hadin b'kosev, nami shayich mitzvah l'kayim divrei hameis, ach gam im lo haya ba'ofen zeh. He says, this is all, up until now we've been talking about verbal instructions, that if he gives the verbal instructions directly to his heirs, so then they are obligated to fulfill this mitzvah. What would be if he writes it down in a will, and he says, this is my last will, and my desire is that even though my entire estate will be divided among my children, but I would like my children to use the monies that they inherit and do such and such with it. So he says there too, there's a mitzvah l'kayim divrei hameis. Now this is not the normal way that we would structure a will. When a person structures a will, he would instruct an executor of the will that a portion of his estate does not go to the heirs, but instead goes to such and such, to so and so. That's not what we're saying over here. What we're talking about over here is where it's clear from the will that he basically says, I want my estate to be divided according to, let's say, the way the halacha states, that it should be divided. My firstborn son gets a double portion, and all of the other children, all the other sons, get a single portion. And then he writes in his will to my dear children, please use a portion of the estate and give tzedakah to such and such a charity, or give a gift to your uncle, Yankel, or whatever it is. He says, Rak tziv al yedei acherim, u'chahagavna deleka mishum mitzvah l'kayim divrei hameis. He says, but if, he says, if there was no verbal instruction and there was no written instruction, but he gives he says, in a situation where he gave instructions to a third party that he would like his yorshim to do such and such a gift to so and so, and in that situation, as we've clarified, that there's no mitzvah l'kayim divrei hameis because the father did not give verbal or written instructions to his children. He says there are those who say that there's still a mitzvah of kibbud av va'em. In other words, even if an heir can wiggle out of the wishes of his father by saying, well, my father never gave me verbal or written instructions what to do with his estate. He basically just says that it's all mine. And now you verified that my father wanted this money to go to a particular tzedakah. But I have no mitzvah of mitzvah l'kayim divrei hameis. But there are those, however, who argue that even if there's no mitzvah l'kayim divrei hameis, there's still a mitzvah of kibbud av va'em. And if I know that my parents' wish was for a portion of their assets to go to a particular tzedakah, what about kibbud av va'em? I have to honor my father and mother. He says, Ulam ledina tzarech iyun, but he says, but there too we have to sort of deliberate. Once the estate goes to the children, okay, whose money is it? Who does the estate belong to? It belongs to the children. We know from the end part of this halacha that the mitzvah of kibbud av va'em only applies to using the father's money to honor him. When the mitzvah of kibbud av va'em is, my father says, I'd like you to buy me some groceries. So I go ahead and I say, Dad, I'm happy to buy you groceries. Can I have your credit card? And he says, no, I want you to use your money to buy me groceries. There's no mitzvah of kibbud av va'em in that instance. Kibbud av va'em only applies to honoring my father and mother with their assets, not with my assets. So there are limits to kibbud av va'em as well. So now the question is like this. Father has not made any explicit instructions to the heirs. He's made it known to a tzedakah or to some other third party that he would like to give a gift. He'd like to give a gift of his assets to a particular tzedakah. The father then passes away, and now the children are the legal owners of the estate. To argue that they have a mitzvah of kibbud av va'em to fulfill the pledge is problematic because it's no longer the father's money. So maybe they don't have a mitzvah because of kibbud av va'em either. The Yeshlomar dekevin shiyarshu hamamon havimamun shelahem ve'enam mechuyavim l'kaim bazet tzavas avihem da'harei kaimelon kibbud av va'em mishel av. Because we know that there's only a mitzvah to fulfill the father's wishes. So again, everything that we're talking about over here is if the father did not properly structure a charge to his children directly, I would like you to give a gift or give a contribution to a particular tzedakah, right? And so there's no mitzvah l'kayim divrei hames. So the remaining question is there a mitzvah of kibbud av va'em? And the answer is, you could argue that there's no mitzvah of kibbud av va'em here either, because by the time we are faced with this prospect of honoring our father's wishes, it's our money, it's not our father's money. So of course, a child might still feel compelled morally to fulfill the wishes of their parents if it's clear to them that their father or mother wanted certain money from the estate to go to tzedakah. But again, many times circumstances change from a parent to a child. Whereas the parent had a certain affection for a charity, a child may not feel that same affection, right? Or may want to give it to a different charity. So a lot of this will depend upon how the decedent structured the pledge before he passed away. Okay.
Can I ask one quick question, Rabbi?
Sure,
And again, I know that actually sponsored this year in memory. So when we give tzedakah in memory of a departed relative, a parent, that elevates their soul. So is that a form of kibbud av va'em or not? And it's our money.
It absolutely is a form of kibbud av va'em. What we're saying is you're not obligated to use your money to honor your parents. But if you do use your money and show honor to your parents, you certainly are doing the mitzvah of kibbud av va'em. If you're learning Torah in memory of a parent, you're certainly doing the mitzvah of kibbud av va'em. Or if you're funding Torah study, then you're certainly fulfilling the mitzvah of kibbud av va'em. There's no question. You may be going above and beyond the letter of the law, right? But it's certainly the mitzvah. Okay, so next, Lamed Zayin. V'yishtaku v'yikablu. If the heirs accept the wish of the decedent, then they have an obligation to fulfill mitzvah l'kayim divrei hames. Rotze lomar shekibel alav beferish o afilu shosak bilvad. This means either the heir expressly said, okay, Dad, I'll do it, or even if he was silent and he didn't say anything, that legally binds him to this halacha of mitzvah l'kayim divrei hames. V'da d'chol zemayri ba'adam bari. Now, up until now, what we've all said is where the person who eventually passes away, is perfectly healthy when he gives this instruction. Aval matnas shchiv meira ein tzarich lahaknosa b'shum kinyan. But if a person is on his deathbed, doctors say he's imminently going to die. So this is what we call a shchiv meira. And assuming that person still is fully lucid and is in control of their mental faculties, then there's a special halacha of matnas shchiv meira that sort of steps in over here. And what happens is like this. Normally, in order for a transaction to be enacted, there has to be a kinyan. I can't just say, okay, my silver chalice now belongs to you. I have to actually give it to you. You have to lift it up in order to acquire it. That's what a kinyan is. But when it comes to a shchiv meira, a person on his deathbed, the rabbis made a special accommodation, knowing that when a person is about to die, we don't want to encumber them with the worry of how am I going to create a transaction when I'm physically so weak and I'm not able to do it. And they felt that if we don't make an accommodation, we may exacerbate the condition of the patient because he's going to be so upset that he can't do certain things towards the end of his life that he would like to, to finalize his estate. And so therefore the Chazal made a special takana that all he has to do is make a verbal declaration, and that immediately affects the transaction. So up until now, we've been talking about a healthy person who expresses his wishes. And there we say that the heirs have a mitzvah to fulfill the wishes of the decedent, even though the money is really legally theirs. But if a person is on his deathbed and he says, I want my silver chalice to go to my friend or to go to a particular tzedakah, then not only are the heirs obligated to carry through with that because of mitzvah l'kayim divrei hameis, but halachically, that chalice belongs to that charity. Halachically, it's not their chalice anymore. Shedivrei shchiv meira kekesuvim v'chimesurim dami, because Chazal made the verbal instruction of a shchiv meira as if the transaction was already done. Ve'ein chiluk bein tziva laseis miyad la'achar moso, o shetziva liyorshev litein la'achar zman. And therefore, it makes no difference if a guy's on his deathbed and he says, give my silver chalice to so-and-so. It doesn't matter if he told them to do it immediately after he dies, or if he said, you can use it, and then after a year, give my silver chalice to that particular charity or to that particular person. Because halachically, that chalice now belongs to that particular tzedakah. And he says, Va'ayin b'shulchan aruch siman reish nun kama pratim begeder v'dinei shchiv meira. I refer you to the Shulchan Aruch in Choshen Mishpat siman reish nun, where it goes into many of the other details of the laws of a shchiv meira. So, as we've seen in this halacha, there are a number of ins and outs of this halacha, right? Of this mitzvah l'kayim divrei hameis. The first sort of in and out, or the first sort of complication or wrinkle, is when is there a mitzvah to fulfill the wishes of the decedent if he did not set aside the asset that he wishes to give away. He didn't set aside the silver chalice and say, here, put this in a segregated place, which is going to belong to Plony. But rather, he just said in general, I would like, certain parts of my silver to be given to, or a certain amount of cash to be given to a charity. If he didn't segregate that the money or the object physically, so then according to some poskim, there's no mitzvah l'kayim divrei hameis. Other poskim argue and they say it doesn't matter that he didn't segregate it. You still have an obligation to fulfill the wishes of the decedent. Another wrinkle that we saw, or like another complication, is that how did he make his wishes known? Did he make his wishes known directly to the heirs of the estate? Or did he make his wishes known to the party who is going to be the recipient of the gift? If he only made his wishes known to the recipient and not to the heirs have no obligation l'kayim divrei hameis. What about the mitzvah of kibbud av va'em? So that too becomes complicated, because one could argue that even though there is a mitzvah of kibbud av va'em to fulfill my parents' wishes, but it's only with the assets of the parent, not with the assets of the child. And once the child has inherited legally the silver chalice together with everything else in the estate, they no longer have the halachic obligation of kibbud av va'em. Okay. And then, just to look at the last line of the Rav Shulchan Aruch, Va'afilu av shetziva livno lifroa chovo pater im lo yorash klum. Like we learned before, let's say a father is on his deathbed and he says, son, I'm left with many debts and I'd like you to pay my debts after I die. Okay, Dad, just tell me what bank account I should use from your estate and I'll take care of it. The father says, well, I have no money. I have no assets, right? I just want you to do this because I don't want people to think ill of me after I die. So there's no obligation to pay back a parent's debts. Ki mitzvahs kibbud av, Eina ela b'momen shel av kemo shenisbaer b'Hilchos Kibbud Av Va'em. But the mitzvah of Kibbud Av Va'em only applies when I'm using the assets of my parents, not when I'm using my own assets. Okay. All right. Questions, comments?
Rabbi, in general for this whole topic, even this last topic that you mentioned, there's obviously the halachic obligation, but I would think as a son or a proper yid, we often do things for Hashem, etc., without question. Like if your father, let's say in that instance, asked you, could you play off my debts because I don't want to have a bad reputation, even though technically you don't have to, I would, as a son, feel if I could do it, I would try my best to fulfill the wishes of my father.
Yes, yes, you would feel duty bound, assuming you had a good relationship with your father. What if Dad was Papa was a Rolling Stone? If you remember that song from the 70s, wherever he laid his hat was his home, and when he died, he left us all alone. Who was that? Who was that? I'm trying to remember who sang that song. But anyway, it's the story about a black kid who who recognizes, and when Papa dies because he got into some brawl or he died from a drug overdose, that Dad didn't do anything for us. So there's still a mitzvah of kibbud av va'em to that person because he gave me life. And so and there are stories like that in the Jewish community also. It's not just unique to one ethnicity. And so what do you do in that situation where people come lining up during the Shiva and they tell you, I'm sorry for your loss, but you should know your father owed us a lot of money. What are you supposed to do? So first of all, one has to identify what their halachic obligation is. That's first and foremost. Let me know what does the halacha say I'm obligated to do in this kind of situation. Then, once I know what my halachic rights and duties are, then I have to make another assessment, which is whether it's because of mitzvah l'kayim divrei hameis or whether it's because of kibbud av va'em. Once I know what my halachic duties are, now let me look at what I feel is the right thing to do based upon what I want my father to be remembered by. And I know I'm saying Kaddish for a parent because I want them to have an aliyas neshama. How else can I create an aliyas neshama? How else can I honor the memory of my parent and so forth and so on? So you're right, Alan. But the purpose of learning many of these halachas is to know not what I should or shouldn't do, but knowing what my halachic obligations and exemptions are. So that will help me form a conclusion of how I'm supposed to live in these kinds or behave in these kinds of instances. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, so obviously it would be individualized. Like let's say your father is a very honorable person and lived his life, beautifully and had some debts and technically you don't have to pay it off, but you want to do it because, it's obviously an aliyas neshama for your father, as opposed to if your father is a gangster and has debts for ill repute type of actions. Obviously, each case would be looked at individually.
Yeah, and it's ultimately with the purview of the child to make those decisions once he's cleared the hurdle of the halacha. Once you've gotten past what my halachic duty is, now you have to ask yourself, so how am I going to look myself in the mirror every morning, right? And that's a separate issue.
Yeah, so that's okay. So I just wanted to make sure that that's part of the equation.
Well, that's part of life. Yeah, everyone has to do what they feel is right at the end of the day, even if they're within their halachic rights to exempt themselves. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Okay. If not, we can at least start the halacha for tomorrow.
Can we have the story tomorrow as well?
Oh, the story. Yeah. So I'll get started on the story, and then I'll finish the story tomorrow. Many years ago, I was named as an executor on an estate for an individual who was a very righteous man. He was a rabbi. Unfortunately, he didn't leave over any children. So he named 3 rabbis in the community to be the executors on his estate. And he was very explicit in his trust documents, the way that he wanted his estate, which was a sizable estate, how he wanted it to be distributed. And he basically broke it down, which is what many lawyers will advise. He broke it down not on set amounts, but he said, I want 2% of my estate to go to such and such a charity. I want 5% of my estate to go to such and such a charity. And there were major yeshivas that whose names you are all familiar with, who were named in this will, or these trust documents. And it was really the role of the executors to really just distribute those monies. All of a sudden, a local charity came forward with promissory notes worth about 75% of the value of his estate, saying that these are debts that have to be collected from the estate before any of the estate can be distributed to the remainder of the estate can be distributed to the heirs, or the charities that are named in the trust documents. And it was quite a sordid tale, because it went to Beis Din, and the Beis Din had to do their own inquiry, even using forensic handwriting analysts to discover whether these promissory notes were forged or not. And I'll tell you the end of the story in Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow.
I think we'll all be back, Rabbi.
Have a great day, everybody. And
God willing.
I hope you're all doing well. Take care.
Take care, Rabbi. Thank you.